The way I see it, they started it. It was a Tuesday afternoon, which, in the sterile, manicured hellscape of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association, HOA, is usually reserved for receiving passive-aggressive emails about the correct angle for shrub pruning. I was standing on my perfectly green, chemically maintained lawn, wishing I were anywhere else, while being verbally assassinated by Gary. "Leo, with all due respect," Gary said, his voice a tight, nasal whine, like a stressed-out piccolo. "The official bylaw states Sherwin-Williams Extra White, Semi-Gloss. Your mailbox, however, is clearly, and I quote from the Architectural Review Committee's notes, off-white, distressingly creamy. It affects property values." I leaned against my distressingly creamy mailbox and gave him my best, slow blink stare. "Gary, my mailbox is 3 feet from my porch. Are you suggesting that a prospective buyer looking at my $400,000 house is going to scream and run because the mailbox is 1% too beige?" "It's the principle!" Gary shrieked, clutching his laminated clipboard like a shield. Gary wasn't the president. That glorious title belonged to Brenda. But he was her loyal, clipboard-wielding, rule-enforcing ghoul. Bylaw 3.4, subsection C, requires visual uniformity within the public-facing facade. Your shade of off-white suggests negligence, Leo. Negligence leads to blight. Blight leads to me getting a $50 fine. I get it, Gary. Here's a $50, I said, peeling a bill off the meager stack in my wallet and handing it to him. Consider this a monthly subscription fee for being a slightly interesting house. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go inside before I become one of the bland people you prefer. He sputtered, but the crisp $50 bill in his hand temporarily short-circuited his bureaucratic brain. That was my life here, a constant low-grade battle against people who had mistaken neighborhood covenants for the 10 Commandments. The real problem, though, had started 2 months earlier. I'm a software engineer by day, but my real passion is obscure tech and space. I was obsessed with getting a clear feed of the Japanese Space Agency's live stream during a mission. This required more than just the usual dinky dish. It needed something decent, something with actual reception quality. So I bought a standard run-of-the-mill 2-foot DirecTV dish and slapped it up on my roof, discreetly. 36 hours later, the mail carrier delivered the thermonuclear bomb of passive aggression, a formal cease and desist letter printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, signed by the Queen of Whispering Pines herself, Brenda. The letter cited Bylaw 8.1 A. No satellite dishes, external antennas, or aerials exceeding 1 meter in diameter are permitted on any residential structure or lot. I tried to fight it. I Googled furiously. I knew about the federal OTARD rule, $47,000, text, CFR plus S, $1,400, which protects the right to install dishes to receive video programming, especially dishes under 1 meter. My dish was fine, but Brenda's letter mentioned an older, larger dish I had initially considered buying, and then they threatened to fine me $50 a day unless I removed any dish, regardless of size, based on a new, ridiculous aesthetic impact clause. I was trapped. I removed the 2-foot dish, sulking. I realized the HOA had cleverly drafted the rule to mirror the OTARD exception. They couldn't ban dishes under 1 meter, but they could be maximum jerks about placement and aesthetics. And they absolutely could ban dishes over 1 meter. For a week, I was defeated. I was relegated to watching grainy, buffered streams on my laptop. It felt like they had won. Then, one rainy Saturday night, while staring out the window at the empty spot where my dish used to be, I was reading a Wikipedia page about deep sky radio astronomy. I was looking at diagrams of massive observatory dishes, and then, bam! It hit me like a solar flare. My eyes darted back to Bylaw 81A. No satellite dishes, external antennas, or aerials exceeding 1 meter in diameter are permitted. The key phrase, the beautiful, glorious, loophole-ridden key phrase, was satellite dishes. Satellite dishes receive signals from satellites. That's their function. Radio telescopes, on the other hand, receive signals from space, from pulsars, from quasars, from the 21-centimeter hydrogen line of the Milky Way galaxy. They are fundamentally scientific instruments, not commercial communication receivers. And the HOA bylaws? They banned satellite dishes. They said absolutely nothing about functional radio telescopes. The sheer, monumental brilliance of the idea made me laugh so hard, I almost choked on my cheap beer. A 2-foot dish? Banned. A 12-foot parabola designed to listen to the whisper of the Big Bang? Technically legal. This wasn't about the space agency streams anymore. This was about defiance. This was about semantic warfare. This was about installing a functional 12-foot, non-satellite receiving metal parabola of pure, unadulterated spite right in my suburban backyard. Brenda and Gary were about to find out what happens when a bored engineer takes on bureaucracy with a dictionary and a massive chunk of aluminum. Game on. The moment the idea solidified, I became a man possessed. The problem wasn't just buying a large dish. The problem was legally ensuring that it could never be classified as a satellite dish. It had to be a genuine, verifiable, functioning scientific instrument. My research started immediately. I settled on observing the hydrogen line, the 21 dollars text emission. It's the electromagnetic radiation created by changes in the energy state of neutral hydrogen atoms, and it's perfect for mapping the rotation of the Milky Way. Crucially, it uses specific radio frequencies, around 1,420 MHz, that are completely separate from commercial satellite TV bands. I found a used 12-foot fiberglass dish from an old C-band installation. The kind of massive, beautiful thing you see rusting in a farm field. It was cheap because nobody uses C-band anymore. Perfect. Then came the technical bits. I needed a proper feed horn, a low-noise amplifier, LNA, designed specifically for the 1.4 GHz amateur radio astronomy band, and a software-defined radio, SDR, receiver. I was sketching out the structure late one night when I got a DM from my old college buddy, Alex, who works at JPL. Leo sends photo of a 12-foot dish on a blueprint. Check out my new yard ornament. Alex: Dude, are you trying to communicate with Jupiter? What is that? Leo: It's a scientific research instrument. Radio telescope, hydrogen mapping project. Alex: In Whispering Pines? That looks like it violates 50 different HOA codes just by existing. Leo: It violates 0. They banned satellite dishes. I'm listening to the Cosmos, not CNBC. Alex: Wait a minute. You're doing this just to mess with the HOA, aren't you? Leo: Perish the thought, Alex. I'm simply pursuing the advancement of amateur astrophysical knowledge within the narrow, arbitrary legal confines of my suburban deed. Alex: A long pause, then 3 crying, laughing emojis. You're a legend. Send me the specs. I'll make sure your LNA is properly isolated so no one can accuse you of watching pay-per-view. His help was invaluable, but his question lingered. Was I doing this just for spite? Yes. 1,000 times, yes. But it was a spite wrapped in the shiny, unassailable cloak of science. The first step was to establish the site. A 12-foot dish needs a solid foundation and, more importantly, privacy from Brenda's prying eyes. I needed a very tall, very sturdy privacy fence. I called Mitch, a local fencing contractor. He showed up in a beat-up pickup, chewing on a toothpick, looking exactly like a man who knew how to build a fence and nothing else. "So, you want 8-foot cedar, solid board, no gaps," Mitch said, squinting at the perimeter I'd marked out. "That's right, Mitch, and I need the posts set in concrete 4 feet deep, not 2. Extra rebar." Mitch stopped chewing. 4 feet? You building a fallout shelter or a fence, buddy? This ain't going nowhere. "It's for the atmospheric research emitter," I replied, trying to sound as serious as if I were explaining the second law of thermodynamics. "We need to ensure structural stability against lateral wind loads, also electromagnetic interference." Mitch stared at me. His eyes were doing that thing people's eyes do when they're trying to determine if you're a genius, insane, or about to run a meth lab. ARE got it. "Look, that's gonna triple the concrete costs, and custom 8-foot cedar isn't cheap." "I'll pay," I said, pulling out a wad of cash for the deposit. "Just make sure that fence is impenetrable. It's vital for the integrity of the data acquisition process." "Data acquisition," Mitch mumbled, jotting the number down. He quoted me an absurd price, clearly signaling his deep discomfort with the whole operation. But I agreed instantly. He shrugged, took the money, and said, "All right, weirdo. Fence'll be up next week. Don't tell me what's going on back there." "Wouldn't dream of it, Mitch." I saw him pull away, slowly, then stop 50 yards down the street to take a photo of my lot. I just waved. Documentation is important. The fence went up, and I had my fortress. Next, the foundation. The dish structure, when fully assembled on its steel pedestal, weighed close to a ton and required a perfectly level, oversized concrete slab to handle the weight and wind shear when it rotated. I hired a concrete crew, headed by a foreman named Jose. Jose was all business. He pulled up, looked at my schematics for the slab. A 10 by 10-foot slab that was 12 inches thick, and rubbed his temples. "Dios mío, what are you putting on this? A statue of a tank?" Jose asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "This foundation is for a 2-story shed, maybe a small boat ramp. This house is small, man. You building an addition?" "No addition, Jose. It's for high-precision azimuth and elevation control." He put his hands on his hips. "Look, I pour driveways. I pour patios. I don't pour rocket launch pads. Explain to me why a suburban backyard needs a slab that could hold a small whale." I launched into my technical defense, making sure to use phrases that sounded important but were meaningless to him. "We need to ensure the structural integrity for the Els El Dolch band feed horn. The mounting needs to withstand microseismic activity caused by local street traffic. We're observing pulsars, Jose. Pulsars are very sensitive to ground vibrations." Jose's eyes glazed over. He pulled out a worn cigarette, lit it, and inhaled deeply, staring at the empty space. "Pulsars. Right. Do you want it smooth finish or exposed aggregate?" "Smooth finish, please. We need minimum scattering for the thermal jacket. Also, the rebar cage has to be perfectly centralized. No shortcuts." "Kid, my crew doesn't take shortcuts. We just don't usually pour concrete for cosmic listening devices in a neighborhood with 0 lot lines," he grumbled. "Okay. It's gonna take 3 trucks and 2 days to cure right. You okay with the noise? Noise is fine, I confirmed. Just tell your guys not to talk about commercial satellite TV around the site. It's bad luck for the deep space observations. Jose just shook his head and walked off to shout instructions in Spanish to his crew. I knew I had sufficiently baffled him into compliance. Technical jargon, spoken with confidence, is the ultimate weapon against contractors who just want to finish the job and get paid. The next day, as Jose's crew was finishing the massive pour, the inevitable happened. Brenda and Gary rolled up slowly in Brenda's pristine white SUV, the official HOA surveillance vehicle. They stopped right next to the new 8-foot cedar fence, peering over the top, their faces tight with suspicion. Leo, prepared, had put on a cheap white lab coat, Amazon Prime, 2-day shipping, and a pair of tinted safety goggles. I walked over, clipboard in hand, I even bought a fancy aluminum one, and approached their car. I tapped the glass with my pen. Brenda, looking murderous, rolled down the window. "Leo," she hissed, "what is this structure? This foundation is clearly in violation of the aesthetic guidelines." I adopted a tone of weary professional patience. "Mrs. Albright, this is a construction site for a federally protected scientific project. I apologize for the visual impact, but the subsurface thermal gradient mapping requires immediate foundation work to ensure stability." "Thermal gradient mapping?" Gary piped up, scribbling furiously on his own clipboard. "What are you mapping? This is a residential property." "It's a long-term study, Gary," I sighed, pointing vaguely at the freshly poured concrete. "We are measuring minute changes in low-frequency seismic dampening across the North American plate, primarily focusing on local ground coupling effects. The mass of the foundation is a crucial variable in the initial data models." Brenda squinted at the massive slab. "But it looks like a bomb shelter." "It's designed to prevent data loss, Mrs. Albright. We must maintain absolute zero-point stability for the eventual installation of the main collector array. Any attempt to interfere with the structure or to measure it without proper certification could compromise years of atmospheric research." I gave them a tight, professional smile. "I've already filed the necessary paperwork with the local municipality regarding the temporary installation of a large scientific apparatus. You wouldn't want to be cited for interfering with a research project, would you?" They looked at each other, their petty bureaucratic tools utterly useless against my flood of pseudo-scientific jargon. They were confused, suspicious, and most importantly, powerless. Brenda gave a curt nod and peeled away, tires squealing slightly. My initial defenses were holding strong, the foundation cured perfectly. I had 3 days of blessed silence, while Brenda and Gary presumably consulted their lawyers, trying to figure out what a subsurface thermal gradient map actually was. Then the real fun began. The delivery day was the most chaotic Tuesday Whispering Pines had ever witnessed. I hadn't just ordered a dish, I had ordered a statement. First, a flatbed truck pulled up, carrying the dish itself. A massive, white, 12-foot aluminum parabola gleaming in the suburban sun. It looked less like a home appliance and more like a prop from a 1950s sci-fi movie. It was huge. It was ugly. It was magnificent. Second, a second truck delivered the heavy-duty steel pedestal and azimuth elevation mount, the guts of the whole operation. It was painted a non-HOA-approved matte battleship gray, because why stop at just one violation? Third, and most gloriously, came the crane. This wasn't some dinky cherry picker. This was a proper, massive hydraulic crane, the kind they use to lift small elephants. It lumbered down the narrow street, tearing up a tiny, insignificant patch of Brenda's precious curb grass as it went. Neighbors were hanging out of their 2-story windows, clutching their coffee mugs, filming the whole spectacle on their phones. I was, for the first time in my tenure at Whispering Pines, the most interesting thing happening. I felt like the conductor of a very loud, very absurd suburban orchestra. The crane operator, a huge man named Mike, expertly maneuvered the boom over my neighbor's pristine gazebo and dropped the dish cradle into my backyard. I watched, filled with the purest sense of schadenfreude I'd ever experienced. Mike climbed out of the cab, stretching his back, and walked over to me, wiping grease on his overalls. "All right, buddy. That's the most ridiculous thing I've lifted all year," Mike said, shaking his head. "Thanks, Mike. High praise coming from a man in your line of work." "Seriously, I used this rig to put a rooftop HVAC unit on a downtown bank last month. You're telling me you need it for your hobby?" "It's not a hobby, Mike," I corrected him, pulling out my clipboard and pointing to the massive steel pedestal. "It's a scientific pursuit. Precision is key. We need to lift the dish, attach the LNA feed, and mount it all to the pedestal's bearing ring, minimizing torsion." Mike looked at the dish, then the mount, then back at me. "Look, I lift stuff. I don't know what a torsion minimalizer is, but my hourly rate is $400. You got maybe 2 hours on the clock here. We moving or talking about space stuff?" "Moving," I said, handing him a water bottle. "Just one thing. When you lift the dish, make sure it's facing slightly off zenith, toward the celestial equator. It helps with the initial calibration." Mike didn't even bother to roll his eyes. He just sighed, got back in his cab, and started the engine. The resulting noise was magnificent. It echoed off every tasteful, gray-shingled house in the cul-de-sac. The actual lift was terrifying and exhilarating. The huge dish swung precariously over my house, then slowly, majestically, settled onto the steel mount. It was a perfect fit. Mike secured the bolts, lowered the boom, and gave me a thumbs up. "All done. You got yourself a satellite dish," he said with a knowing grin. "A radio telescope, Mike. Remember the official terminology." He laughed, a deep, booming sound that probably violated the HOA's quiet hours. "Whatever you say, buddy. Pay the man. I gotta go lift a yacht." The crane left, and the silence descended again. But it was a different silence, a silence now dominated by a colossal aluminum monument to spite. The dish was installed. Over the next few hours, working inside my new cedar fortress, I attached the specific 1.44 text, Jihats, Chlor, feed horn, and the low-noise amplifier Alex had helped me tune. I ran the coax cables underground into my basement lab, where the SDR receiver was waiting. Finally, the moment of truth. I plugged everything in, fired up the software, and began the calibration. I pointed the dish towards a known strong source, the core of the Milky Way, where the hydrogen line should be clearly visible. I watched the waterfall display on my screen, waiting for the hiss of cosmic noise to organize itself. And then, there it was. A beautiful, distinct spike in the spectrum at 1420, 406 MHz. The signal of neutral hydrogen gas, the whisper of the galaxy. The telescope was functional. It was indisputably a radio telescope. It was observing the universe, not receiving commercial programming. I went back outside, looked up at the huge, defiant structure towering over my neighbor's prize-winning petunias, and pumped my fist. Less than an hour later, the official HOA complaint arrived. Gary, riding a HOA-branded Segway, taped it to my front door. The letter was 6 pages long and felt hot to the touch. It wasn't just a fine, it was a full-on declaration of war. It started by ignoring my scientific project entirely and citing new creative violations. 1. Violation. 1. Structure not approved. The structure, designated by the owner as a radio telescope, exceeds the maximum allowable height for any accessory building or fixed apparatus by 15 feet. 2. Violation. 2. Aesthetic nuisance. The structure constitutes a severe visual blight and is directly detrimental to the harmonious and uniform appearance of the community. 3. Violation. Obnoxious defiance. This one wasn't a bylaw, but it was in the text. The board finds the placement and size of this item to be a calculated and malicious act of defiance against the established covenants and architectural standards of Whispering Pines Estates. Your actions are an unacceptable expression of contempt for your neighbors. They demanded immediate deconstruction and removal within 48 hours, or they would file an injunction in county court and assess a fine of $500 per day. My reaction wasn't panic. It was a calm, slightly manic sense of focus. They had gone nuclear. Now I could too. I called Alex and my retired property lawyer friend, who I've nicknamed the Colonel. They filed, Colonel, I told him. Brenda finally showed her hand, did she? The Colonel's voice was dry, like sandpaper. Did they cite the satellite dish rule again, or did they pivot? They pivoted. They're hitting me with accessory building height and aesthetic nuisance. But notice what they didn't include. A ban on scientific instruments. Clever girls, the son, Colonel mused. But they're still missing the big picture, Leo. Federal preemption always trumps local pettiness. I'll see you tomorrow. Bring the coffee and the printouts of your pulsar data. I spent the rest of the evening making highly professional-looking charts and graphs of my 21-cm hydrogen line observations, labeling them with scientific rigor. I felt less like a homeowner in trouble and more like a defense attorney preparing for the trial of the century. The HOA meeting was held in the poorly lit, smell of stale coffee community room. I sat alone on one side, facing the entire board. Brenda, Gary, and 2 other terrified-looking people who just wanted their dues to cover the pool maintenance. Brenda, wearing a suit that was aggressively tailored, opened the floors. Mr. Thompson, we are here to discuss the unapproved, unsightly, and, frankly, massive dish that you have erected in your backyard. It's a radio telescope, Mrs. Albright, I corrected mildly. And its erection was necessary for the study of galactic rotation curves. I don't care if it's a portal to Narnia. It's 12 feet tall and violates Bylaw 5.7 regarding accessory structure height. She slammed her hand on the table. Ah, but is it an accessory structure? I countered, sliding my 3-ring binder forward. Bylaw 5.7 defines an accessory structure as a detached building or apparatus intended for storage or recreational use. My apparatus is used for scientific research, which is neither storage nor recreation. Furthermore, the Amateur Radio Astronomy Protection Act of 1998, while not explicitly federal law, provides a precedent for allowing structures designed solely for passive scientific observation. Gary leaned in, squinting at my jargon. But the rule about satellite dishes, Bylaw 8.1 HOA, it's clearly a dish. It is a dish, yes, but it is not a satellite dish, I explained patiently, as if talking to toddlers. A satellite dish receives signals transmitted from Earth-orbiting satellites. My instrument, which I can prove with spectrum analysis right now, is receiving signals emitted by hydrogen atoms rotating around the center of the Milky Way, 27,000 light-years away. It is listening to deep space, not DirecTV. The distinction is legally and technically profound. I slid a printout of the hydrogen spectrum over to them. Brenda stared at the graph, which looked like something drawn by a drunk toddler. But the labels, velocity, kmss, intensity, jy, neutral hydrogen, were intimidating. The board members looked utterly defeated. They couldn't argue with science they didn't understand, backed by a lawyer. The colonel was waiting in my car, just in case. "This is a technicality," Brenda shrieked. "It is the law," I said, gathering my papers. "I await your lawsuit, Mrs. Albright. But please note, suing a man for listening to the stars will make you look profoundly silly in front of a judge." I walked out, leaving them in stunned silence. Round 1. Leo. The stalemate lasted exactly 4 days. Brenda was not a woman who accepted defeat gracefully. She decided that if she couldn't beat me with bylaws, she'd try to beat me with fear. It was 7:00 a.m. I was in my sweatpants, sipping coffee, and monitoring the $21 plage text line. It was a particularly exciting day for galactic arm rotations. I heard the unmistakable sound of a police siren, not speeding, but deliberately pulling up to my curb. I opened the front door to find 2 uniformed officers standing on my lawn. Officer Davis, a young guy with a weary look, and Officer Chen, a middle-aged woman who looked like she'd had a very long night. "Mr. Thompson?" Officer Davis asked, adjusting his belt. "That's me. To what do I owe the pleasure? Did a neighbor's dog finally unionize?" Officer Chen did not smile. "We received a call regarding an unauthorized communications antenna broadcasting signals without a license. Specifically, the caller mentioned potential unauthorized military or terrorist signals." I stared at them, and then I realized Brenda had gone full conspiracy theorist. "Gentlemen, ma'am, I am appalled," I said, adopting a tone of injured dignity. "Please come around the back. I'll show you my terrorist signals." I led them past the high cedar fence and into the shadow of the massive dish. They stopped dead in their tracks. "Holy cow," Officer Davis whispered, staring up. "That's what they were calling about?" "This is the apparatus in question," I confirmed. "The caller, I suspect, is Mrs. Brenda Albright, president of the HOA. She is engaged in a semantic battle with me over neighborhood aesthetics." I ushered them into my small basement lab. "Now, about those signals. This is the output." I gestured to the screen showing the spectrum data. "See this spike? This is the $1,420 text. Just large frequency band. That is the 21 dots or so text. Hydrogen line, officer. It is an emission of neutral hydrogen, a fundamental element of the universe. I'm listening to the Milky Way, officer. See? We're tracing the rotation of the Sagittarius arm." Officer Chen frowned, pointing at the screen. "So, you're getting space signals?" "Precisely. Passive observation only. This structure has no transmitting capability whatsoever. I am receiving information from literally millions of light-years away. Unless the terrorist cell is based in the Triangulum galaxy, I think we're good." Officer Davis looked completely defeated. "So this is a really big satellite dish that isn't a satellite dish." "A radio telescope, and it is completely compliant with all FCC regulations regarding receiver-only equipment," I clarified, handing them a printed explanation of radio astronomy. "It's a civil matter, officers. A very, very petty civil matter." Officer Chen sighed, massaging her forehead. "Look, Mr. Thompson, we can't touch this. You're not breaking any laws we enforce. We'll log the call as unfounded, and note that the apparatus is a scientific instrument, not a communications device." As they walked back to their patrol car, Officer Davis paused. "If you pick up anything cool, like an alien concert, let us know." "First call, officer. First call." Brenda's escalating tactics didn't just annoy the cops. They tipped off the local media. I'd been posting sarcastically on a hyperlocal neighborhood app, and someone leaked the police report to the Springfield Chronicle. The next afternoon, a news van parked right in front of Brenda's house. I watched from behind my curtains as Brenda nearly choked on her artisanal cracker when she saw the camera crew setting up. The reporter, a young, earnest woman named Sarah, came to my door. I agreed to an interview immediately, provided I could wear my lab coat and goggles. In the interview, I gave them gold. I stood next to the fence, pointing dramatically at the dish towering over the suburban roofs. Sarah: "Mr. Thompson, neighbors are concerned this massive structure is dangerous." Leo: "Dangerous? It's only dangerous to ignorance, Sarah. This is a scientific instrument. I am using a sophisticated passive antenna array to study the fundamental building blocks of our universe." Sarah: "The HOA president, Brenda Albright, calls it an eyesore and a menace." Leo: "Mrs. Albright is welcome to her opinion. I believe enforcing uniformity to the point of suppressing amateur scientific research is the real menace. They tried to ban my small satellite dish, so I researched the bylaws and found a solution. Build a legal radio telescope instead. It's an American story, Sarah. The little guy fighting bureaucracy with technical accuracy." I finished with the perfect deadpan kicker. My project is literally called Hydrogen Observation Array, HOA. It's a permanent fixture. The segment, titled HOA versus the Stars, went viral locally. My phone blew up. People were driving by slowly, giving me thumbs up. I had successfully turned myself from the neighborhood weirdo into a local, anti-authoritarian folk hero. Brenda was now the villain of the week. Brenda, humiliated by the police and the press, retreated but didn't surrender. She found a new bylaw, Bylaw 6.2, Noise Ordinance, specifically citing mechanical noise audible beyond the property line after 8:00 p.m. A week later, I got a new letter. The dish, when rotating, generated an unacceptable level of mechanical noise and vibrations that were disturbing the peace and sleep cycles of her and Gary. This was pure fantasy. The motorized mount was whisper quiet, especially compared to the lawn mowers or the screaming children at the neighborhood pool. To prove her point, she hired a professional noise abatement contractor, a bored-looking guy named Sam, with a high-tech sound meter. Sam showed up, looking annoyed, and clipped a meter to the fence post. Brenda and Gary stood 30 feet away, watching him with hawk-like intensity. I walked out in my regular clothes this time. No more lab coat theatrics. "How's the noise pollution, Sam?" I asked. Sam pointed to the meter. "It's showing 45 decibels, maybe 48. That's quieter than a library, mostly ambient street traffic." Brenda stormed over. "Rotate the dish, Leo, when it rotates." I sighed and went back to my controller. I activated the motor to turn the dish a full 180 degrees. The motor was nearly silent, a soft, high-pitched whir. Sam watched the meter. "Okay, when the motor's running, it spikes to maybe 50 dB right here, but that's still below the city's limit for residential daytime noise, let alone the HOA's stated limit of 60 dB. Unless you plan on rotating this thing every 10 seconds, I can't cite you. Brenda's face was beet red. But I can hear it, at night. It's a humming sound that vibrates my windows. Sam shrugged, packing up his gear. Ma'am, respectfully, that's not a legal noise complaint. That's just a noise that annoys you personally. My report will state the apparatus is well within acceptable sound levels. As Sam drove off, Brenda stood there, defeated. But then her eyes narrowed. The motor! That's the loophole. They can't ban the dish, but they can ban the mechanical moving parts. I knew she was already drafting the next bylaw update. She wouldn't quit until she found a rule the dish violated. I had to preempt her. I realized Brenda had a point. If the HOA could argue that the motor was a prohibited mechanical device, or that its noise, however faint, was a perpetual violation, they could win. My sarcastic solution was to give them exactly what they wanted: a noise-compliant, motor-free device. I grabbed my toolkit. First, I disconnected the motor from the azimuth and elevation gearing. Second, I bought a length of heavy-duty steel pipe, some bicycle chain, and a massive old-fashioned ship's wheel from an antique store. Third, I spent 2 days engineering the most ludicrous, unnecessary contraption ever built: a manual crank system attached to the dish's gear reduction. Now, to point the 12-foot dish, I had to walk outside, grab the ship's wheel, which was mounted on the fence pole, and crank it manually, grinding the gears to shift the angle by a few degrees. It was absurd. It was inconvenient. And it was silent. It violated zero-noise ordinances. I even had a custom brass plaque made and mounted on the fence post next to the wheel. HOA compliant, hand-crank-powered scientific attitude adjuster. No mechanical motors or electronic components employed. Fully compliant with Bylaw 6.2, noise abatement. The next time Gary drove past, he saw me out there in the evening, leaning into the enormous ship's wheel, turning the 12-foot parabola a few inches at a time, like Captain Ahab steering his suburban ship. He just stared, his mouth hanging open, and drove away without a word. I had won the battle of absurdity. My victory was short-lived. Brenda was not a quitter. She was a predator, and she was backed by the collective dues of 200 homeowners. She knew she couldn't win on the technical merit of the dish, so she attacked my wallet. The final letter arrived via certified mail, delivered by a man in a suit, a real lawyer's messenger, not Gary on a Segway. This was serious. The letter was from Blackwell and Associates, a prestigious, expensive law firm. They weren't fighting the dish. They were suing me. The claim was for specific performance, a court order forcing the removal of the dish, and damage to community assets and property value depreciation. The key phrases were terrifying. They claimed the visual blight had caused a 50% property value crash in the immediate vicinity and demanded $200,000 in damages to cover the lost equity of the 10 surrounding homes. This wasn't a fine. It was a ruinous lawsuit designed to scare me into compliance. I felt a genuine knot of fear in my stomach. This was real money, real lawyers. I wasn't just fighting Brenda anymore. I was fighting an entire legal machine. I immediately called the colonel. $200,000 for aesthetic depreciation? I chuckled nervously. It's a bluff, Leo, but a good one, the colonel said, his voice calm. They know they can't prove 50% loss over an aluminum bowl, but they know the discovery process alone will cost you $50,000. They're banking on you folding. So we fold? Hell no. We fight. You've maintained the technical high ground the entire time. Now, we use the law that matters, federal preemption. We argue the HOA's actions are an unreasonable restriction on a scientific endeavor. The colonel arrived at my house the next day. He was a small man with a neat mustache and a lifetime's worth of disdain for petty authority. "Walk me through the history of the dish, Leo," he instructed, taking notes on a tiny pad. "I need every interaction, every time you asserted it was a scientific instrument, and every time the HOA tried to use a non-satellite bylaw to restrict it." I recounted the mailbox, the police visit, the media segment, and the absurdity of the hand crank. "Beautiful," the colonel said, smiling thinly. "The hand crank is genius. It proves your good faith effort to comply with reasonable restrictions, while highlighting the unreasonableness of their demands." Our primary defense was built around 3 pillars. 1. Technical semantics. It is a radio telescope, science, not a satellite dish, commerce. 2. Federal preemption. The dish falls under the broad protection of amateur radio scientific operations, which state and local governments cannot unreasonably restrict. 3. Malicious intent. We would argue the HOA's actions, calling the police the absurd $200,000 claim, showed clear malicious intent and harassment, turning them from guardians of the neighborhood into personal bullies. "They think they're fighting an ugly structure," the colonel concluded, closing his notebook. "We are going to make the judge realize they're fighting knowledge." We met the HOA and their high-powered lawyer in a mediation room at the county courthouse. Brenda wore a look of self-righteous fury. Gary just looked terrified to be in a building where rules actually mattered. The HOA's lawyer, a slick young guy named Chad, started strong, focusing immediately on the visual blight. Chad: "Your Honor, we aren't contesting whether this is a radio telescope or a satellite dish. We are contesting the size and placement of a structure that is clearly detrimental to the community's aesthetic cohesion and property values. It is, by definition, an oversized, unapproved, industrial-looking apparatus in a residential zone." The colonel stood up slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He just spoke with the calm finality of a historical document. The colonel: "Counsel's argument is an excellent summary of the problem, Your Honor. The HOA is applying restrictive covenants intended for things like garden sheds and clotheslines to an instrument used for astrophysics. I submit to you that a neighborhood covenant cannot supersede the spirit of federal law, which protects amateur scientific and radio operations, lest every HOA in America be allowed to block the advancement of science simply because it's ugly." He then pulled out the photo of the hand crank. "And regarding unreasonableness, my client removed the motor, a feature required for his research, simply to comply with a frivolous noise complaint. That is good faith. The HOA responded by demanding $200,000 for a speculative loss in equity. That is harassment." I watched Brenda's lawyer, Chad, sputter. He couldn't pivot back to the satellite dish rule because the colonel had trapped him. If it wasn't a satellite dish, the HOA's rule was an unreasonable restriction on science. The mediator, a kind, exhausted woman who had seen 1,000 HOA disputes, recessed for 30 minutes. When she returned, she looked directly at Brenda and Chad. "The court finds that the structure is, by its function and technical definition, a radio telescope, and is used for non-commercial scientific observation. Furthermore, the court finds that the HOA has engaged in an unreasonable and disproportionate campaign to force the removal of an apparatus which is fundamentally protected under the broad umbrella of amateur scientific research rights. The final ruling was short and sweet. The HOA's demand for removal of the radio telescope is denied. The request for $200,000 in damages was thrown out. The telescope was legal. Brenda's reaction was exactly what I had hoped for. Her jaw dropped, her carefully constructed facade shattered, and she let out a small, high-pitched noise, somewhere between a hiss and a squeak. She turned, purple. Gary rushed to get her a glass of water. The colonel patted me on the shoulder. "You're keeping the dish, Leo. You fought bureaucracy with semantics and won." I looked over at Brenda, who was glaring at me with the pure, unadulterated hatred of a defeated despot. "I know, Colonel, I know." It was the most satisfying victory of my life. The walk out of the courthouse felt like a ticker-tape parade, though it was just me and the colonel. The war was over, and the stars had won. The news spread faster than a rumor about an unapproved fence color. Brenda's humiliation was complete. Within a week, she had resigned as HOA president, citing personal health reasons. I'm pretty sure the only health problem was her crippling inability to admit she was wrong. Gary, her sad little clipboard sidekick, faded into obscurity. The neighborhood was split, of course. The hardcore conformity types glared at me, muttering about precedent and blight. But the majority? They loved it. Old Mrs. Henderson, who had always complained about noise, brought me a fresh-baked pie. "I always thought that Brenda was a tyrant," she whispered conspiratorially. "I just never knew how to fight her. Thanks for the show, dear. I tell everyone you're listening for extraterrestrial life." Kids started hanging out near the fence, asking to see the spaceship tracker. I was now the cool, eccentric guy, not the annoying one. The new HOA board, terrified of their own bylaws and the potential for another Leo, immediately drafted an addendum. All homeowners must now submit a full technical specification and peer-reviewed scientific justification for any apparatus exceeding 1 meter in diameter. Too late. The precedent was set. The Hydrogen Observation Array was a permanent, legally protected monument to pettiness. Having won the right to keep it, I decided I might as well use it. The dish was huge, it was ugly, and it was mine. I wasn't going to lie. My initial scientific ambition was 90% spite and 10% genuine interest. But after the ruling, the genuine interest shot up. I calibrated the dish meticulously and started actually tracking the Milky Way's spiral arms. It was genuinely fascinating. I posted the results on a public website. Whispering Pines Deep Space Data. I organized a neighborhood star party. I set up my laptop in the backyard, displayed the waterfall graphs, and pointed the crank-adjusted dish toward a specific point in the sky. A dozen neighbors showed up, kids included. I explained how the invisible $21 text, $600 signal told us where the hydrogen gas was, and how we could map our own galaxy just by listening to the static. "So what's that noise?" one of the kids asked, pointing to the loud hiss coming from the speaker. "That, young man," I said, with full professorial gravity, "is the sound of the universe. It's the sound of the galaxy rotating, the slow, cold hum of all the stars and dust." It was ironic. The massive, illegal, ugly dish became, for a single night, a weirdly wholesome community asset, all because the HOA had tried too hard to be petty. The whole thing cost me thousands in legal fees, thousands more in contractor payments, and nearly a year of my life battling against a suburban tyrant. Was it worth it? Absolutely. It wasn't about the channels. It wasn't even entirely about the science, though I do genuinely enjoy listening to the hiss of the cosmos now. It was about the principle. It was about exposing the beautiful absurdity of rules made for the sake of control. I looked out my window this morning, past the perfectly manicured Sherwin-Williams extra white houses, and saw the massive, defiant dish gleaming in the sun. It was an anomaly. A glitch in the matrix of conformity. It was a reminder to everyone, including myself, that if you're going to fight the machine, you might as well use its own weapons against it. Find the loophole. Exploit the technicality. Go big or go home. I haven't heard a peep from the new HOA board. They seem to have learned their lesson. Leave Leo and his bizarre scientific apparatus alone. They've moved on to banning much safer, less technically protected forms of rebellion. I saw Gary the other day. He was trying to enforce a new, desperate bylaw. No inflatable pool toys shaped like marine mammals exceeding 5 feet in length. I just smiled, went back inside, and pulled up Amazon Prime. Time to order an inflatable orca the size of a Ford F-150. They'll never learn.